Welcome to XP. I'm Cameron, and today we're gonna level up your 2D smoke game in After Effects so you can do things like this. In order to create successful smoke animations in After Effects, there's one simple technique that you need to master. In this tutorial, I'm going to cover 3 different examples so that instead of just copying the technique, you learn how to apply it creatively in unique situations for your own projects. Okay, so we're in After Effects now, and this is our final composition. And in this composition, you can see I have 3 different references for the smoke. And inside of this comp, we have 2 nested comps, the character and vehicle and the background layer. The character and vehicle comp is where we're going to be doing most of our work. So inside of here, what I've actually done is I've just shied all the layers. So if I unshy using this button, you can see all my layers are there still. We're starting with the exhaust smoke, so I'm going to dive right into that. And that is actually inside the vehicle composition. Okay, so now I'm going to click on my exhaust reference layer. I'm just going to drop the opacity to 30% so we can see what's going on. I'm also going to solo the tailpipe and exhaust reference layers so I can just focus in on what's important. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is get one of these circles going so we can start our animation. Now you could come in to After Effects and grab your ellipse tool and create this yourself. However, I'm just going to jump into Illustrator, and because I use Overlord, it's very easy to just push this in. Overlord is a plugin I highly recommend if you're doing a lot of Illustrator to After Effects workflow. It just really saves a lot of time and makes your life very easy. Okay, and I'm just going to give this a name. I'm going to call it Smoke 1 because naming your layers is super important. Always do it. Don't be that person who doesn't. Okay, I'm going to bring that behind the tailpipe. I'm just going to change the color as well. Go yellow. The next thing we're going to want to do is start adding our animation. I'm going to drop in a position animation at 2 seconds and another one at 3 seconds. I want to make my animation span 1 second so it's easier to loop later. Then I'm going to drop another keyframe for position, and I'm just going to edit the position of these so we get something starting to happen. Okay, let's take that a bit further out. And then our final keyframe, this is where we're animating it out. I'm also going to add some curvature to these so our animation is just a little bit more interesting. You can see how useful this reference layer is for getting this close to what we want. Then I'm going to add some scale animation, and I want this to scale up at this point, and I want it to scale out at this point. Okay, so let's just preview that. Now you can see there's something funny happening with the speed between this part of the animation and this part of the animation. So what I'm going to do to fix that is just right click on this keyframe and go robe across time, and you can see that just smooths that out really nicely. I'm also going to add an easy ease to the scale animation just so it loops out really nicely. I think I'll take that up to about 160. Okay, now it's interfering a little bit with the edge of the tailpipe, especially at this point, so I'm just going to drop that down to 80. Okay, so now we have the basis for our whole animation at this point. So the next thing I'm going to do is duplicate this probably about 6 times, and then I'm just going to open the animation of all of those, and I'm going to edit the scale on each one because I want to create a bit of variation so it's not the same boring animation over and over. Okay, so I'm just going to take that up to about 180. Okay, so now we have some scale variation. Now we're going to add some position variation. Okay, so now you'll see what's starting to happen. We're getting this nice separation so that when we offset these animations, it's really going to look lovely. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is pre-comp these layers. So if I use Ctrl-Shift-C, it'll bring up this pre-compose menu, and I can just give it a name, and let's call it Exhaust Smoke Pre. Okay, now I'm going to jump into that, and We created all our animations over 1 second. So I'm going to come to 3 seconds here, and I'm just going to hit N to change my work area to 1 second. So the next thing we want to do is make the smoke animation loop. And because we've created our animation over 1 second and there are 6 layers, what we can do is take our frame rate, which is 24 frames per second, divide it by the number of layers, which gives us 4 frames. So what we want to do is offset each one of these animations by 4 frames. But before we do that, I'm just going to duplicate them, send another set to the top, and I'm using motion tools for my sequencing, but you can manually change these if you like. I just like to use tools like this because they make it much faster and easier. So I'm going to hit sequence after changing my offset to 4, and I'm just going to drag this back, and you can see that just creates a perfect loop for us. Now we can go back and we can delete our exhaust reference. Okay, so the next thing we want to do with this is make it loop, because right now it's only looping internally and we want to make it loop out in this pre-comp. So the way we can do that is actually add time remapping. So if we go enable time remapping, just drop in some keyframes on 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then just remove the keyframes on the outside. What we can then do is add a nifty expression called loop out, and that'll just loop these exhaust fumes really nicely. What we have right now are some very hard circles, and they're not interacting with each other in any way. And in order to create a certain sense of interest and realism, we've got to do something. So if I click on my exhaust smoke, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to my effects panel. I'm going to type in fast to get my fast blocks blur, drop that in, increase the blur radius to about 5, and you'll see what that does. It just creates a bit of blur around our objects, and we're starting to get some transparency. The next thing we want to do is go to the levels effect. So if I click on the layer again, add my levels, we can come in and change the channel to alpha, and you'll see when I start dragging in these handles, it starts to crunch in on that alpha channel, and we're getting these objects starting to kind of meld into one another, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Now you can see when I really crank this in, it adds this pixelation. That's okay at this stage, because the next thing we're going to do is add a roughen edges, which is just going to perfectly smooth that out. We're going to get rid of the fractal influence, and now you can see we have this much more interesting smoke where these pieces of smoke are kind of popping off from one another, and this is really what we're looking for. And the last thing we want to do there is just parent that smoke to the tailpipe. Now you'll see it just moves with the tailpipe, and we have something really interesting happening. So we're back in our character and vehicle comp, and the next animation we're going to tackle is the smoky dust trail at the back. So I'm going to solo the layer, grab my ellipse tool, and if I click and hold Control and Shift, it will scale the circle from the center. I'm just going to make it about the height of that trail. Then I want to drop in some keyframes, the position keyframe on 2 seconds and 3 seconds, and I'm going to just change the initial keyframe to about there and the final position keyframe to about there. Then I'm going to go inside of my ellipse transform properties. These are the internal transform properties of the shape layer. So I can come in and drop another position keyframe on 2 seconds and 3 seconds, and another one at 12 frames in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select both the start and end position keyframes, and I'm just going to drop them down below the smoke layer. And if I add an easy ease to the central keyframe, you can see I get a lovely arc that's been created. Of course, we need to name this layer, so let's call it Dust 1. Let's give it a color as well. Okay, so now I'm just going to duplicate this twice, select U to open up my keyframes, And I just want to adjust the scale of these two. So I want to give this a scale of about 70 and this scale of about 80, just so there's some variation. The next thing I want to do is come up to my rectangle tool, and I'm going to create a rectangle just below my dust reference layer, and I'm going to call this base. Now this might not make sense at this point, but you'll see later why I'm putting this in. So now I'm just going to grab all three of these layers and I'm going to pre-compose them, and I'm going to call this dust free. Now I'm going to jump into dust free, hit U to open up my keyframes, and I'm going to change the work area to 3 seconds. And again, we want to create a loop. We have our animation happening over 1 second again, and we have 3 layers. So if we divide 24 by 3, that gives us 8. So we know we need to sequence these with a space of 8 frames. So if I select all 3 layers, duplicate with Ctrl D, bring them to the top, change the color, hit U to open up the keyframes, select all of them, sequence by our 8 frames, drag it back. You can see we now get a perfect loop. However, we have no visual interest. None of the layers are interacting. There are these sharp gaps in between. It's very vectory and uninteresting. So in this case, instead of adding the effects to the composition itself, I'm actually going to stay inside of the composition and come and drop in an adjustment layer. And what an adjustment layer does is applies any effects that you apply to it to the layers below. Now I can come up to my effects, drop in a fast box blur, change it to something like 15, grab my levels, punch the alpha channel. Now you can start to see why we have this base layer, because we're getting this lovely interaction between the base and these circles. So once again, we have some jaggies, some pixelation on the outer edges here. So once again, grab our roughen edges, drop it in, get rid of the fractal influence. Now if I go back to this comp, I can come up to my rectangle tool again, because we want to get rid of this base. So when you have your rectangle tool selected, with the composition it automatically creates a mask. So I can just come in and create a mask. Now you can see that top bit is cut off. The next thing I want to do is make this look a bit more like our reference layer. So if I look at the reference layer, it has this nice angle, this nice tilt to it. So if we have a look at our dust pre again, we can come up to our effects panel and look for an effect called CC slant. And you'll see if I change the floor to the base of our smoky layer and change the slant, you can see exactly what starts to happen. So I'm going to change that to about 80. And now we have something much closer to the original and much more interesting. The one thing I do notice is that adding the effect here creates a bit more transparency on the edge of the smoke layer or the smoke trail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this with Ctrl X, go into our dust layer, and I'm just going to drop it inside of our adjustment layer and take it to the top, so that we can use our extra adjustments to just crunch the alpha out of that. Okay, now if I go back into this composition, we need it to loop. So we can go to enable time remapping, drop in our keyframes, remove our in and out keyframes, add our loop out. Now we have something that's looking great. We can also use these time remaps to change the speed of the animation. So I'm just going to crunch this down to about 12, so it's a really fast smoky trail. And the final touch is just going to be adding the blending mode overlay, changing the opacity to 50%, just so it matches our dust reference. Now we can actually delete our dust reference because we have exactly what we need right here. Okay, so the final smoke animation that we need to tackle is this one here, which is the smoke coming from the fire on our character's head. So I'm going to solo this, and in order to create this effect, I'm going to start off dropping in a solid. Let's just call this smoke solid. Okay, then I'm going to take this down. I'm going to duplicate our smoke reference because I want to pre-comp both these layers. I'm going to call this smoke pre. So now we can go into smoke pre, and you can see we have our smoke solid and our smoke reference. Now I actually want to recompose smoke solid again, and let's just call this smoke pre. And now if I come into Smoke Pre, if I hit Control K and come up to Advanced, change my anchor to the left and change my width to 1500, basically change the size of my comp, and this is what I need for this particular animation. Now if I hit Control R, click on this layer, I just want to get a ruler at the midpoint as a guide. So now if I come up to Layer, New, Shape Layer, and I grab my rounded rectangle tool this time, I'm just going to draw a shape on top of this solid. You can see it has these rounded edges. If yours aren't as rounded as this, you can actually hit your right arrow key. So you can see if I hit my left arrow key, it takes away the rounding completely. If I hit my right, it rounds the circle completely, and that's what I'm looking for in this case. Just going to change the color of this so we can see it a bit easier. Now if I come into rectangle and rectangle path and I right click and go convert to Bezier path, I can come in and manually adjust these points. That's kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, let's give this a name. Let's call it Smoke 1. So now I want to click on my path again and grab these endpoints. If I select these points and I double click, I get this bounding box around them. And if I click and hold Control, it allows me to squash both ends like this. I'm just looking for a nice taper, a nice consistent taper on this. You can even come in and adjust these handles slightly. The next thing we want to do is use the Smoke 1 layer as a mask for this solid. So the way we do that is using the track matte function in After Effects. So if I click on this layer and I can just click on Alpha Matte, and you can see that the solid is now being masked by the layer above. Okay, so the next trick I'm going to use is an effect called Wave Warp, and this technique that I'm going to apply is something I learned from Jake Bartlett in one of his videos, and I'll link to that video below because his video goes into a lot of detail and depth when it comes to creating variation with the wave warp effect, so you don't end up with something that's very mechanical and consistent. So if I come up now, drop in an adjustment layer, drop our wave warp effect on top of the adjustment layer, and you can see what starts to happen, and this automatically animates. Okay, so for starters, I'm going to change the wave width to about 350, and I'm going to change the wave speed to 2, and I'm going to change the wave height to 60. The next thing I want to do is stop these edges from moving, because for this effect I don't want them to be wiggling too much. I want them to be locked in place. So the way we can do that is change our pinning to vertical edges, and you can see exactly what that does. Lovely. So now we want to add a bit of variation to this animation, because right now this wave warp is very consistent. So the way we can do that is duplicate our wave warp effect, and we can change our wave speed. So I'm going to make it 1. Already there's a bit of variation, but you can see the waves are cancelling each other out. The way to fix that is using your wave width and adding some variation. So I'm going to make this 500. Now we get something that's a little less consistent. We can also come in and change the direction. So if I make this 80 and make this 100, we get even more variation, and that can be really nice. So now if we go back into our Smoke Pre, if we look at our original reference, you can see that the wavelengths are kind of almost on par with one another, and that's not what we have. So what we can do is we can actually come in here, move this over to the left slightly. Then I'm going to grab my rectangle tool. We're just going to mask the top of this layer just like that. Now if I duplicate this, hit M and change our mask to subtract. So what you can do at this point is change the timing of your smoke of one of your layers, so that you get these layers to be animating more at the same wavelength. Now I want to go back into my character and vehicle layer. If I hit Y, I can change this anchor point right about there. And now I just want to make sure that I have something similar in size and width to our reference. Okay, so looking at that, we can scale it down just on the one axis, just slightly. Let's make it 53, so take it down by exactly 10. Yeah, That's looking good. Okay, I'm gonna go back into my pre-comp. I'm going to click on this layer and drop in a null. Take it above, parent this layer to the null as well. With this null, what I want to do is create a scale animation to get, again, a bit more variation. So what I'm going to do with this middle keyframe is just on the x-axis, minus this by about 80, drop in some easy ease by hitting F9. We're going to loop this out. Okay, so now we have this scale animation, and if I change the timing of this, you start to get something interesting happening, and you can actually time this with the wave warp effect to get something interesting. The next thing I want to do to add some more visual interest is add in another circle. So change the color of this to the magenta. And let's call this offshoot. If I hit position, drop in some position keyframes in our usual positions, because that also creates a nice consistency in our animation. Now if I come in and have this just pop out, let's copy and paste that animation to the end. So you can see it pops out. I'm going to add a scale keyframe to this so that it goes from 100 to 0. I'm going to add an easy ease to that first keyframe to slow it down slightly. Now if I copy and paste both these keyframes to the end here, I can again add a loop out. If I go right click, copy expression only, Control V on scale, you can see that loops out, just does its thing. Again, you can change the timing on this to make it something interesting. I'm going to duplicate this because I want another iteration of this going. If I grab my 2 position keyframes, just make this go somewhere else. If I change the timing, we'll get something more interesting happening. Okay, so now these are interacting together quite nicely. The last thing we need to do is our typical technique that we've been using throughout the smoke tutorial. And let's go and do that. So if I drop in an adjustment layer, drop in a blur, 15 this time, get rid of our smoke reference. Add a levels, drop in our roughen edges, get rid of our fractal influence. You know the drill at this point. I'm going to increase the border to something like 12. Now we have some nice interactions between our offshoots and our wavy smoke. This is looking good at this point. We just need to put some finishing touches on. If we look at our smoke reference, let's actually bring it up so we can see it a bit better. We have this gradient going on, and we want to get that on our smoke pre as well. So if I come up to our effects panel, type in ramp, we can drop in an effect called gradient ramp. This immediately applies a gradient. Then if we click on our smoke reference, we can see that we have this gradient there already. So I'm going to come to smoke pre, hit the lock button so that it keeps this information in the effects panel. If I come up to smoke ref, click on fill, I can actually just copy and paste this information right in there. Then if I change the start and end points of the ramp, I get a lovely gradient. The final thing to do is take a look at our blending mode and our opacity. So we just need to match that with a multiply and a 20% opacity. The only thing left to do is get rid of our smoke reference. And now we can just preview our smoke animations in all their glory. Look at them. They're beautiful, they're wonderful, and we've learned so much in the process. Thanks so much for watching. The project files for this animation are linked below, so feel free to check that out as well. And if you got any value from this tutorial, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out a lot. I'm a big believer in free education on YouTube, as I've used it myself countless times to grow my own skills and abilities, and I would love to help budding creatives do the same.